Hello and welcome to Frontline. This is Latitude, a weekly show on India's foreign policy and national security, and the global developments that have an impact on it. On May 10th, India and Pakistan declared a ceasefire following 4 days of escalating military hostilities. This came in the aftermath of the terrorist attack in Pahalgam, in which 26 people were killed, and India's reprisal military attacks inside Pakistan after that, called Operation Sindoor. Our guest today is Srinath Raghavan, historian and author of several books, notably War and Peace in Modern India, and his most recent work is Indira Gandhi and the Years That Transformed India. He has served in the Indian Army. He has been a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He's also the official historian of the Kargil War. Professor Raghavan, welcome to Latitude.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Professor Raghavan, it's 4 days after the ceasefire announced by India and Pakistan. The question on top of everyone's minds is, will this ceasefire hold?
Well, it looks like the ceasefire will hold because both India and Pakistan at a political level have said that their immediate objectives for this particular crisis have been achieved. So I think there is definitely at the political level a desire not to see a resumption of hostilities at the full scale. At the same time, we have been seeing reports about violations of ceasefire by Pakistan, firing, drone activity, etc. Again, I'm in no position to verify how accurate these reports are. But I will say this much, going by, looking at the ends of various conflicts that we have fought in the past, ceasefires always take a little bit of time to stabilize. People tend to be trigger happy, tend to be a little jittery. There is always some very local jostling for advantage, even as every conflict comes to an end. And this is true practically of all the wars, crises that we fought. I mean, even in Kargil, for several days after the ceasefire was happening, I mean, there used to be sporadic sort of movement, exchange of fire, constant conversations between the Directors General of Military Operations on either side is required to make sure that it is stabilized. So I wouldn't overread into what is happening now. It seems to me to be well within the pattern. And as I said, the most important thing is that at the political level, it seems like we do have a ceasefire.
So the signing of the ceasefire itself has led to a lot of anger in India, especially in the in the BJP's core constituencies, and even in some sections of the Indian strategic community, even in the Indian military, that we have in effect snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, as one commentator has put it. Did India have a choice of actually continuing the hostilities until a victory had been extracted from it?
Well, victory in any military context, whether it is a war or a crisis, is only to be measured based on the political objectives for which that particular conflict is being waged. If our political objective was a total defeat and destruction of Pakistan, then yes, perhaps we should have continued this conflict till that particular end was either attained or it became absolutely clear that it was unattainable. In this case, however, it does seem, and I'm here going by the official briefings which have been given by the military spokesperson, the Director General of Military Operations, in his press conference the other day, also explained. The Prime Minister has given a speech. None of it suggests that our objectives were that much more than instilling a degree of fear and caution in Pakistan, that support for acts of terrorism against India will go punished, that you cannot have impunity, and that we will impose costs on you in order to get you to desist from these kinds of activities. So that seems to have been a much more limited objective. In fact, in today's newspapers, I saw that there are articles by former senior military officials, retired, which I suppose reflects the thinking within the military, which is to say that our objective was not to even expect that Pakistan will entirely dismantle its terrorist infrastructure. We wanted to punish, we wanted to cause damage to terrorist infrastructure, and send out a signal that in the future, this punishment will be forthcoming. And that is all towards the end of establishing deterrence, of preventing the recurrence of such attacks, which I think is a much more limited, circumscribed objective than this idea that we have to once and for all solve the problem of our relations with Pakistan, whatever that might mean.
So this is the third punitive strike against Pakistan in 9 years. The first was in 2016, that surgical strike after Uri, after the terrorist attack on the Uri headquarters, brigade headquarters. The next one was in 2019 after the suicide bombing in Pulwama, which killed 40 CRPF personnel. And now this one after Baisaran in Pahalgam, the terrorist attack there. So every attack has been about deterrence, about punishing Pakistan, about getting it to cease and desist from, enabling terrorists or even using them directly as proxies in India. So net, what do you think really has Operation Sindoor, as this operation was called, what do you think it has achieved? What have been its achievements?
Well, there are two questions here. I think the first question is whether military strikes of the kinds that we've carried out since 2016 are by themselves going to solve the problem of terrorism for us. And for a variety of reasons, I believe that is not the case. This can be one part of a larger package of response that we have, but it is unlikely that it can solve. And I'd say upfront that unless and until we harden our counterterrorism infrastructure within Jammu and Kashmir itself, commensurate to the new kind of situation that exists there, we are likely to see that some of these sporadic attacks will continue because it is relatively easier and low cost for terrorist organizations and their sponsors to carry out these kinds of attacks. So I just say that much, we can pick it up later. As far as the objectives of Operation Sindoor, whether we have achieved, I think we have demonstrated that India has both the capacity to attack Pakistan and impose costs, and that we have the will to do so. So both the capability and the will have been demonstrated. The capability has been demonstrated for carrying out standoff strikes against a range of targets, not just terrorist infrastructure, but also headquarters of organizations which were supporting terror, wider military installations across the Punjab and other parts of Pakistan. So I think both geographically and in terms of weapon systems, we've deployed apparently, and I'm here just going by reports of what we see, weapon systems like BrahMos, which were apparently struck their target, particularly the Noor Khan Air Force Base in Pakistan, which suggests that some of the technologies that we have developed with the Russians jointly, which is indigenous a cruise missile system, has shown its capability in a conflict situation. So I think there have been a series of such things that we have achieved. Now, the question is whether we expect that these attacks will, in a sense, restore deterrence. But that, I think, puts too much of a burden on just these kinds of actions. Deterrence always operates at least two different levels. There is what we call deterrence by punishment. Yeah. So you punish someone for an act, thereby sending a message that please do not do this in the future, otherwise you will get the same retaliation, right? A lot of domestic crime is about deterrence by punishment because that's what the laws are there for. That's what the police is there to implement the laws. But there is also another form of deterrence that we call deterrence by denial, which is to say that you harden your defensive capabilities to the point where it becomes much more difficult for the other side even to carry out attacks. And that is at least as important as deterrence by punishment. To give you the analogy, if you want to sort of protect your house from being burgled, you won't just depend on the laws of the land to deter potential burglars. You also want to put up fences, you want to put up electrification, you may want to have security guards, right? So deterrence by denial is, to my mind, at least, in fact, much more important when it comes to things like terrorism, precisely because terrorism is a very low-cost activity for the other side to carry out. And there are a number of groups. There is a lot of floating capability to carry out these kinds of things. So I think if we are really serious about deterring terrorism, we need a combination of denial and punishment. I think because of the background to the present crisis, we are very much focused purely on the punitive aspects of what our response should be. I think the denial-based aspects need at least as much consideration.
Over the last few days, one phrase that is being used a lot is that Operation Sindoor has established a new normal. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also used this phrase in his address to the nation. The other is that India will treat every future attack as an act of war. If the signal here is that India will not hesitate to carry out punitive attacks again, has India sufficiently demonstrated conventional capacity to do this in this particular operation without crossing and without the danger that this can cross the nuclear threshold?
So again, let's take it one by one, right? I mean, the first question is, what does it mean to say that we will treat every future terrorist attack as an act of war? right? And again, I think the Prime Minister is basically trying to establish what you would think of as a red line, to say that if any activity which sort of transgresses that line, then it will invite retaliation of a very significant kind, right? And again, I don't think we need to literally sort of read it to say that India is going to go out to all-out war. I mean, war, you're saying that it will invite military retaliation is the way. The second thing about saying it's a new normal, and again, I've seen that phrase being used in official language, but also in some of the sort of commentary that we have seen from people who are kind of closer to the system. Again, I do wonder what it means to say that we are capable of continuous strikes on Pakistan, because the way I understand these situations is that from a crisis to a crisis, if you really want to make sure that you are sending a strong message, the message has to get stronger. Otherwise, there is nothing much to be done. If we had done, a response similar to what we did in Balakot in 2019, which was a single standalone strike, then perhaps the message would not have been as strong. But this time we have struck a variety of targets geographically. We have used different kinds of weapon systems, and we have not even hesitated from striking terrorist areas which are close to population centers, right? All the while allowing that our intent is not escalatory, etc. But again, there has been both a geographic and weapon systems based escalation of our capabilities, right? So if I may use a mechanical metaphor, with every turn, the screw will get tighter. With every crisis, the threshold of using force will have to increase. That is in the logic of things. Pakistan has its own capabilities. I mean, this time around also, it has demonstrated that it can impose costs on us, even as we try to punish it. And you can be pretty sure that the Pakistanis will prepare for similar contingencies and even better, even higher sort of levels of use of force for the next crisis as and when it comes around. So I do not believe that the threshold is going to be the same. The threshold will increase. And that is the problem. If we are going to say that this is a new normal, please remember that the new normal will get old very soon. And then there has to be a newer normal. And that newer normal takes you further up the chain of escalation. And that then means that all other kinds of possibilities of where these conflicts could end up will come into play much more quickly than they did this time.
Right. So during this particular conflict, Professor Raghavan, did you personally think that it was going to end in a nuclear conflagration?
No, I don't
Did
think
you?
so, because the nuclear threshold, as stated by Pakistan, is a significantly higher one. I mean, if we go by what the Pakistanis have said in the past, I mean, and which stands to reason, even without having their assurances, is that nuclear weapons will be something that they will use if they feel that the very political existence of Pakistan is at stake, etc. Right? I mean, that is a very different level at which we are talking about it. But the concern, and it was not necessarily a concern that I had during this particular crisis, but I think the general concern when it comes to crises involving nuclear powers is not so much about whether there is clear intent to use nuclear weapons, whether there is a rational calculation at play saying, oh, if we hit India, then India can destroy us, so should we not be using them at all? Rather, crises, and here I'm talking as a historian who has studied many of these things, not just in the India-Pakistan context, but in many other contexts. Crises tend to be very confusing situations. There is an absolute lack of clarity about the capabilities and the intentions of the other side. There is something called the fog of war, which obscures real-time understanding of what people are doing. So if you get to certain kinds of weapon systems and certain thresholds of using force, the line between what is conventional and what is potentially nuclear can get blurred. And that is when, action-reaction chains can set in. And, things can get pretty sort of uncertain very quickly. So we should not therefore overestimate our ability to stay in control of every situation, or hope that the Pakistanis will be absolutely rational and in control as well.
Which is what I was going to actually ask you. Did you think that India had enough control over the escalation ladder in
Well,
this
I mean,
particular conflict?
on this occasion, I would say that yes, the Indians did manage to make sure that the escalatory dynamic did not get out of control as far as they were concerned. Whether they had escalation dominance or not is a second order question. We'll come to that in just a minute. But I think the Indian response at every time was calibrated. We kept saying that we are only responding to what Pakistan is doing at the same level, by which we mean what's the kind of weapon systems, what kinds of targets, etc. And we kept saying that we do not want further escalation, and that we do not want to sort of make this into a long conflict, which I think was a good thing. But as I said, escalation is not a one-sided activity. It also depends on how the other side, right? I mean, escalation typically is an outcome of the interactive moves made by each side. When one side uses some force, the other one has to do more. Then the other one, first party, has to do more again. So there is a sort of a upward spiral, which is the way that we should understand this, right? And the metaphor of the escalator itself is an interesting one. I mean, imagine that you stand on an escalator, you can only get out at the top,
Yeah.
right? So there is a certain inexorable momentum to it.
Yeah.
In our strategic discussions, we tend to sort of use the oxymoron of an escalatory ladder. Escalations and ladders are very different things.
Yeah.
And we should never be so confident that, this is like climbing up a ladder. An escalator
You can
has
come down a ladder, but you can't come down an escalator.
or at least you can only go up to a certain point and then take the
Yeah.
escalator back down, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's what you're talking about escalation dominance. Some international media reports also suggested that a turning point to the conflict came when the Pakistani leadership was reported to have summoned its National Strategic Command after India hit the air bases inside Pakistan, notably Chaklala Air Base, which is in Rawalpindi. And Pakistan denied thereafter that such a meeting had been summoned or that it took place. But if such a meeting was indeed summoned, what was Pakistan's intention? Was it just signaling or did it actually intend to use nuclear weapons? What's your thinking
Again,
on
as I said, I mean, the Pakistani threshold, both in terms of what they have stated in the
Yeah.
past, but also what stands to normal kind of strategic political reason, is much higher. It will be a weapon of more or less the last resort, as it were, for Pakistan to secure itself. It is not something that they will contemplate using very easily. And again, if you notice the Pakistani press conference, the DGISPR repeatedly kept saying that there should be no war between nuclear armed neighbors, etc.
Yeah.
Now, from the Pakistani perspective, however, I think it also stands to reason in a crisis like this to keep insisting that the nuclear threshold is not very far away. They have to kind of signal that in order to catalyze external intervention. Just as it stands to reason for India to say that, we will not succumb to Pakistani nuclear blackmail, which is what the Prime Minister has also said. And this is again a posture which goes back a long time. After the Kargil War, General V.P. Malik, if I'm not mistaken, said in a seminar that the Kargil War has shown that there is space for limited conventional war against a nuclear backdrop. So we want to assert that there is a space. The Pakistanis want to deny that the space is as wide as we would want it to be. And they would want to catalyze external intervention. So I think the suggestion that the Nuclear Command Authority was meeting, etc., was intended to convey a message to particularly the United States, which apparently till that point of time wasn't taking the crisis quite as seriously as perhaps the Pakistanis would have liked, in order to then catalyze the kind of intervention, which I think is precisely what happened. So I think the Pakistanis, we have to make a distinction between their declaratory posture and what they say with what they do. And again, in a crisis, these things might be very difficult to disentangle. With all the benefit of hindsight, we can now look back and perhaps there is a lot more to be learned by us about how these things played out. But to me, it does seem like once the Pakistanis had struck, or at least claimed to have struck some Indian air bases, and following that, there was an Indian retaliation which struck their air bases. I think at that point, the Pakistanis felt that they had done enough to domestically be able to claim that they could call it quits. And the only way then to reach towards de-escalation quickly was to get external actors to get involved more seriously. And I think the nuclear sort of, the argument that, that the Nuclear Command Authority is going to meet, etc., was perhaps, they may well have perhaps intended initially to do it, but either way, I think the signaling utility of it was much stronger than the practical one.
Right. So, one of the things that's being said about India's response after Pahalgam is that by announcing that India would punish the perpetrators that carried out the attack in Pahalgam, but leaving it there for 2 weeks, India lost the element of surprise that is usually crucial to any kinetic operations, thus handing Pakistan an advantage. Do you agree with this view?
Well, at some level, I think even if the government, let's assume hypothetically, had not said that they will do so, I think the general expectation was very much that there will be a kinetic response. And at least, that was the expectation, I think, amongst a large number of people, whether we agree or disagree about what the efficacy of those kinds of actions are. Simply because there has been a past pattern of that kind of use. We have signaled that kind of posture to Pakistan, but we have also signaled the same posture to our domestic audiences. So I think it stands to reason that, some such action would have followed. And again, getting the element of surprise in any of this, Nirupama, I think is actually quite difficult, because see, 2019, because we had never used an airstrike against a terrorist facility.
Yeah.
And again, let's remember that even that was not in POK, that was in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, right? I mean, which is also Pakistani territory proper, not territory that, we claim as part of India. So, but that was a one-off, and that was the first time we did it. So this time around, I think the expectation should have been that the Pakistanis will be much better prepared. And, that therefore you needed more time for preparation, more thinking through what we needed to do. But also, I think this time we took a little bit of time to make sure that we used capabilities which we could then demonstrate to the rest of the world quite clearly. That was again a bit of a question mark which was constantly being raised because Pakistan denied that anything had been struck in 2019. So this time around, I think we wanted to have a very clear thing, which was shown in the very first military briefing that we saw. So I think we wanted to take our time, but you're right, that element of surprise is difficult to achieve in these contexts, even if it is vital.
So Prime Minister Modi, when he made his speech, he said that instead of supporting India's strike against terrorism, Pakistan started attacking India itself, targeted our schools, colleges, gurdwaras, temples, civilians, and our military bases. The sentence is a little puzzling to me because it sounds as if India was expecting the Pakistani state, Pakistan, not to respond.
I would be very surprised if there was a baseline assumption that the Pakistanis would actually not respond at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the military plans would have been expecting a retaliation of some kind. Because, as a military, you have to prepare for the worst case scenario.
Yes.
And see, in Pakistan, as we know, there are, multiple centers of decision making and power. I think the civilian government is perhaps one of the weakest in the history of Pakistan, and is already on the ropes as far as the economy and other things are concerned. The Pakistan army itself has been under a lot of pressure from a variety of fronts, right? I mean, they've not managed to have reasonable relations with the Taliban. They're having a serious problem on hand in Balochistan. The TTP and other groups have kind of been nipping very hard at their heels. So I think it's, in a sense, in this kind of a situation, if the Pakistan army were to show weakness, or at least not attempt to sort of hit back and then claim a victory, which was the normal course to expect, it would have been a very surprising thing, actually. So I think the baseline expectation should have been that they will have as much compulsion. But I think what the Indians perhaps may have expected is that the Pakistanis will look for an easier off-ramp than perhaps what eventually ended up happening, which is that the conflict actually went on for perhaps longer. That was perhaps an expectation we could have had. But those are difficult things to predict upfront. We don't know how a crisis plays out. We don't know where the possible points to sort of actually de-escalate are. So it's a little difficult to say what those expectations were, but I think certainly from the military point of view, they would have been prepared for retaliation from Pakistan.
There have been several international reports, media reports, that have spoken about India losing anywhere between 3 to 5 aircraft. At one of the media briefings, when Director General of the Air Force Operations, Air Marshal A.K. Bharti, he was asked about these reports. He said losses are normal in a combat scenario, and that India had caused heavy damage to several Pakistani air bases. Does the damage we might have done to the Pakistani airfields compensate for the loss of the aircraft, if that is true? It has not been officially accepted, but this seems to be, the way he put it, seems to me an acknowledgement, an indirect acknowledgement that there were some losses.
I mean, at least there was not an outright denial, right? I mean, I don't think the Indian government has denied any of those reports. And those reports were kind of coming in pretty much from the time that the news of Operation Sindoor started flashing early morning India time. I think the Air Marshal is right to say that in any conflict you should expect losses, and that there are things that we have done which also have to be taken into the balance sheet. But I hope and I'm reasonably confident that the Air Force will do its own kind of internal reviews on this situation. Because at the end of the day, this was an operation that was planned and executed at a place and time of our choosing. As I said earlier, the element of surprise was always difficult to achieve in this. But if it is indeed the case that in the very first strike, the Pakistanis managed to impose, costs of this nature on us. I'm not talking about the magnitude. I'm just saying that if they manage to sort of take down Indian aircraft and other things, then perhaps there is something for the Air Force to look carefully and learn lessons from about how these operations were planned and executed. I mean, there's a famous saying by the Prussian general, von Moltke, who said that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. That is absolutely true. The minute you are in war, all plans tend to. But that does not mean that you do not plan, nor does it mean that you do not learn the right lessons or the best lessons that you can once the dust of war is settled. And I really hope that the Air Force will, and I'm pretty sure they will do it. I mean, we've always done it in the past. There is always after action reviews and other things which are carried out. So whatever is set for public consumption, I think the important thing is that the military learns the right kind of takeaways from this crisis, because there will be crises to come in the future.
So, what are the lessons from this crisis?
Again, at this point of time, it is very difficult to say because there is just so much that we do not know. And I'm here putting on my hat as a historian. Even when you have so much material, your judgments tend to be
So,
quite tentative.
I meant military lessons. I mean,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I would say that the key military lessons to say are things which we should expect out of any such crisis or conflict, which is that Pakistan has again demonstrated a degree of ability to impose costs on us even as we exercise options to punish them. Their not just technology but operational posture was such that they could do this. At the same time, we have managed to also sort of inflict costs on them and have used some new technologies which were perhaps deployed for the first time. And I think, we should both learn that, the threshold at which international intervention gets catalyzed is still the fear of escalation to a nuclear conflict. And I think that should be very important because, as I said, the next crisis, the threshold of force will have to be higher. The screw will have to get tightened with the next turn. And at that point of time, we are going to have even lesser window because the crisis will start at a much higher level of escalation. See, in 2019, you did one strike. This time around, you've done a bunch of strikes. Next time around, you have to do something more or something different, something qualitatively and quantitatively different. And that will mean that the Pakistani response will also be different because they would be expecting you to do it. That is the way they will take away their learnings from this. So the next crisis will, I think, escalate rather more quickly. And therefore, we should be sort of prepared that we may not have even this much of a window to do what we want to do.
And by saying that this is the new normal and that every future terrorist attack will be an act of war, have we actually, does this run the risk of, um, handing over the levers of this conflict, of any conflict in the future, to elements that want to start a war?
Well, certainly that is one way of one potential implication. And again, we have in fact made that possibility somewhat more difficult by saying that we will treat every act of terror as an ipso facto an act which has been initiated as an act of war by the Pakistani state, right? So we have drawn a very tight link now between these, which also means that we do not have any kind of there is no onus on us to establish that these attacks actually have anything, right? I mean, so all of those expectations are thrown overboard. We will treat every act of terror as if it's an act of war initiated by the Pakistani state, and that our reprisal is sure to come, and that this is the threshold from which things will begin. Then, you are setting yourself up for crises which will escalate more quickly and more sharply, and perhaps will catalyze international intervention of other kinds as well. I mean, again, just think about it. Here I'm just speculating, but we need to put ourselves in the other side's shoes from time to time when we think about military matters, right? I mean, it's not just about what we have done, but what they will do. If you are Pakistan military today, one of the strongest incentives you will have is to sort of acquire greater operational and strategic proximity to China. Because if it is the case that, India is going to hit you automatically every time something happens, and you have no desire to sort of wind down those assets, then, you better prepare for other eventualities. And I think diplomatically, the United States is the country to catalyze, but militarily, perhaps it will be China. And again, I'm not saying that the Chinese will get involved in an India-Pakistan conflict simply at the behest of Pakistan. But as we have seen, I mean, the issue is not just this time around the use of Chinese technology, which has been reported, but the fact that Chinese operational concepts have been used by the Pakistan Air Force. That could not have been done if there was not a degree of operational and military coordination between those two sides prior to this conflict coming on. So they have been sort of preparing and training to use these in certain ways. So, the problem with a lot of analysis typically is that tends to focus on technology. Technology is important, but the operational concept within which a technology is deployed in war is more important still. And there, I think the operational concepts which they have deployed seem to be those which are borrowed from the PLA Air Force, which has created them for other kinds of contingencies like Taiwan. So we need, therefore, to be mindful of the fact that the Pakistanis will want to go further in this. So that has all kinds of implications for how our relationship with China plays out. That said, the Chinese were initially, they did condemn the attack, which because they themselves have concerns about Islamist terrorist organizations in Pakistan, in China, and China doesn't generally take this. But once it became clear that there was an Indian strike, etc., which was imminent, then we saw that the Chinese were willing to give more cover to Pakistan, particularly in the UN Security Council context. We did have a statement which was supportive of India and condemning the terror attack, but refused to sort of name the group which had claimed responsibility, etc. So some degree of cover was given. And subsequently, when pointed questions were raised, the Chinese sort of spokespersons have said that, that military action against India is unfortunate, etc. But frankly, given the nature of China-Pakistan relations, I would expect that they should do at least that much for an ally, right? I mean, so my concern is that, the way that this crisis has played out and the expectations that it has set for more kind of sharper and perhaps shorter crises going forward, there may be now a greater degree of coordination between China and Pakistan about such contingencies in the future.
So what does that actually do for the normalization process that India started with China? What is going to be the fallout on that?
See, the normalization process was driven by concern between India and China about their disputed territory and about China's unwillingness to abide by understandings that had been reached in very clear, explicit terms. Right? They've overturned existing understandings, which led to greater deployment of forces on our sides. Of course, they have also deployed. So there is an interest now in slowly de-escalating and then finding a way back to other kinds of things. So that is a process which is halting, slow. It has taken a long time even to get to this pass. So I do not believe that, in a sense that one way or the other, we should be too optimistic about where that particular process of de-escalation is going, right? I mean, it is going to take its time. There are other kinds of challenges that we have in our relations with China, particularly on economic issues and so on. And in any case, at this point of time, the overall sort of Indo-Pacific situation has been so kind of confused and scrambled by American policy that perhaps we are also just waiting and watching to see what is going to happen. So I actually do not believe that this particular crisis is going to set back our attempts at normalization with China. I think those attempts were slow, halting step by step. And I think that is the way they will proceed.
The other diplomatic fallout of this is, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, he has claimed that he mediated the ceasefire, that he threatened to cut off trade for both India and with both India and Pakistan, and that he would also like to help India and Pakistan reach a solution on Kashmir. And India has denied these claims. India has always held that Kashmir is a bilateral dispute. And over the last years, even this formulation has narrowed to the point that there is no scope for discussion on anything other than terrorism emanating from Pakistan and for the return of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. But isn't the risk of internationalizing the Kashmir issue inbuilt in any military action against Pakistan? I mean, isn't this something that we should have factored in as we went into this?
Again, I'm reasonably sure that we would have factored in some degree of internationalization or gathering of international attention on this issue. But in the scheme of things, given the nature of the attack and what we wanted to accomplish, I think those were seen as more manageable problems. Perhaps at the diplomatic level, those could be handled. Now, President Trump, I think his claims are, as with most things he says, you just have to wonder how much of it is fact and how much of it is hyperbole. But seems clear that the Americans did make phone calls, get the two sides to talk to each other. The Indian account is that the Pakistanis were told by the Americans that they should take the first step to reach out. And again, I think whichever way you present it to domestic audiences, it doesn't matter. The fact is that you have a ceasefire, and that the American involvement in a matter of several hours actually, I think, has helped us to get to this point. And if President Trump wants to take credit for that, I think he's entirely entitled to take that credit. Why not? At the end of the day, his administration has kind of put a blanket on this particular crisis. And again, I'm not so sure that it was that the Indians wanted a continuous escalation. So from even our perspective, it was useful to have an off ramp at a point when we believed that we had made the point that we wanted to make by using military force in quite this way. Now, as far as the story of internationalization of Kashmir is concerned, again, it's worth recalling that President Trump, I think in 2019, when the Indian government had, more or less diluted and nullified Article 370, had even at that point of time said that he'd be more than happy to sort of sit with India and Pakistan and mediate a solution. And our response, which was given by the MEA spokesperson, if memory serves right, was to say that this is a bilateral issue, that in the similar agreement we had sort of agreed and so on. Now, as I see it, that remains our position. In fact, as you say, it is perhaps narrowed and hardened since. But there is one sticking point, or rather there are two sticking points. One is that, in this crisis, in response to our decision to hold Indus Water Treaty in abeyance, the Pakistanis have said that they will also treat the similar agreement as an abeyance, right? Which means to say that they will not abide by the understandings of the similar agreement. The operative parts of that understanding in the current circumstance are the line of control, which is an agreed line between the two sides. I mean, it's not a border, it's not an international border, but it is an agreed line. There is an agreement, the Suchetgarh Agreement of 1972, with maps signed, which we flashed on television when the Kargil War happened. And the similar agreement, whose one of the main intentions and outcomes of the agreement was to bilateralize the problems and say that all measures should be taken to resolve bilaterally. And we did that partly because for several years before that, we were under a lot of continuous international pressure to say that we should speak to Pakistan. The Americans put that pressure on us, Americans and the British, after the 1962 war, when we turned to them for help against China. In 1965, the Soviet Union, after the mediation of the ceasefire in Tashkent, did convey to both sides that we need to sort of have a peaceful understanding, etc. So one of our intentions of the Indira Gandhi government in 1972 was to make sure that we have an agreement from Pakistan that this will be discussed bilaterally. Now, with Pakistan putting that in abeyance, it effectively means that there is no such mutually understood thing. Now, that has two consequences. One, it means that Pakistan is at liberty to keep raising these at various international fora, drumming up support.
Yeah.
My own expectation is that once the initial sort of fever over this crisis subsides, it is unlikely that Pakistan will be able to gather that much of support. But we should be mindful that in any future conflict or any crisis of this nature, this remains, the international pressure point remains something, right? The second thing that we need to understand is that India is not in the same position that it was in 1962 or 1965 or any of those decades. Our relationship with the great powers has changed considerably. We matter a lot more to the United States, to Russia and other countries for them to be able to sort of pressure us to do anything that we do not want to do. I think even though there has been no official refutation of the claims saying that India and Pakistan will meet at a third party location, neutral location, right? And when was the last time? Tashkent, 1965. I don't think all of that is in the realm of possibility. I don't think the government of India can be sort of pressured to do any of that stuff. But at the same time, India cannot unilaterally insist that this is a bilateral problem. That is also gone. So there is always a window, not just for Pakistan to raise it, but for other countries to keep flagging it, to say that India and Pakistan should talk. So this will be an irritant. It will be something that we will have to expend some degree of diplomatic energies in order to parry those kinds of claims. But that is the situation in which we find ourselves now.
Yeah, and just as we thought that we were over this problem, basically, that, after the abrogation of Article 370, that we had actually successfully managed to convince the world that the Kashmir problem was essentially over, and that now it was, India's problem alone to sort out what remained internally in Kashmir, and Pakistan had absolutely no say. So it's come back to a point where it's sort of 370, pre that act of abrogation of 370. Do you see it as that?
I don't actually, because I do not believe that the application of 370 would have taken Kashmir away from international sort of spotlight in to the extent that it existed. It was not the same as in preceding decades. That much I've said already.
Yeah.
Because see, 370 is effectively a move about the constitutional relationship between Jammu and Kashmir and the Union of India. That does not take away from the fact that India still claims that there is an part of Jammu and Kashmir state which is under Pakistani occupation. Yeah, we never said that by abrogating 370, we do not that we are writing off our claims to POK. In fact, the problem cannot go away in an international sense till such time either we agree that POK is with us, back with us, or that we agree to sort of have a clearly defined international border. So 370, contrary to all the talk and commentary here in India, was never about removing Kashmir as a problem. It was about changing the nature of your relationship with that particular within the constitutional framework of India. And that gave you certain kinds of powers to deal with the internal security dimensions of it because the union, as a union territory, you also had more powers vested in the union government for how you could deal with law and order, etc. But I think none of that would have been a solution to the Kashmir problem. I mean, I don't think, because there is a contradiction between saying that we want POK back and that the Kashmir problem is solved. I mean, both things cannot be said in the same breath. So I think the international dimension of it remains. It will remain till such time India and Pakistan find a solution to that problem. In anticipation of a question, I may just say that I do not believe any such solution is possible in the near future or even in the middle term future. There are many problems in international politics which are not amenable to solutions. You can either manage them or you can endure them. I think that is the realm in which we are.
I'll just come back to Kashmir, but before that, I wanted to ask you about the reaction of the world, not just the United States, but also of all its friends that India approached and who counseled India and said that, well, you have to sit down and talk to Pakistan, and basically counsel both sides that they should show restraint and talk this out. And this is being seen as in India as pandering to Pakistan, that the world is once again pandering to Pakistan. And the question that has arisen from this is, well, we thought that the world's interest in Pakistan ended when they when that whole war in Afghanistan ended, when the US forces and NATO forces pulled out in the way they did in 2021, and that Pakistan had become irrelevant to the world. Now people are surprised that Pakistan is still relevant. So why is Pakistan still relevant to the world, if that is what it is?
No, because I think the baseline assumption that Pakistan only matters to the world because of certain kinds of, its strategic location, etc., have always been proven to be wrong, because Pakistan has reinvented itself from time to time in the sense of what it makes it important. See, and in international politics, a country of the size of Pakistan, with the kind of population that it has, a nuclear weapon kind of endowed military, is not going to be treated as an absolute sort of outlier and a pariah in the way that we may want to Pakistan to be treated. In fact, I noticed even during this crisis there was a lot of hand wringing saying the IMF has approved the loan for Pakistan, etc. I mean, that's not the way international politics works. Every country, every sovereign country has its own position, has its own role. In the past, the United States needed Pakistan for a variety of reasons. During the Cold War, Pakistan was a frontline state as far as keeping an eye on certain aspects of Soviet Central Asia, etc., is concerned. Subsequently, in 1971, Pakistan was very important because it helped the Americans to reach out to China, which is why at the in the greatest war which was fought between India and Pakistan, the United States actually stood squarely by Pakistan. But from 1999 onwards, we have seen that the Americans are rather more concerned about the nuclear dimension of this conflict and have counseled both sides to come back and so on. Right? So I do not believe that just because the war in Afghanistan has ended, the United States does not have any interest in Pakistan. I mean, please remember that Pakistan has a lot of Chinese military sort of capability. The Americans have an interest in having some window into what all of those is working on, because Pakistan also operates their military sort of platforms. So I just believe that it will be naive and hasty of us to assume that Pakistan is somehow going to be dumped by the rest of the world and that everyone is going to line up against Pakistan in quite the way that we want. As far as China is concerned, I think they have the highest geopolitical interest in keeping Pakistan in place, right? I mean, Pakistan is important to them in order to sort of keep India to maintain a degree of balance with India in the subcontinent. Pakistan, through the CPEC corridor, etc., gives them overland access to the Indian Ocean region, which is absolutely important. They do not have it through any other country. And as they say repeatedly, Pakistan has been an all-weather friend. In fact, the China-Pakistan relationship has weathered all kinds of ups and downs. So why should we expect, therefore, that the rest of the world is, Pakistan is a kind of a basket case or a pariah for them? No country is kind of dismissed in quite this way.
The other question that arises from this is that why does the world not recognize that Pakistan uses terrorist proxies, or that the efforts the world has made, such as the Financial Action Task Force or designating various terrorist groups that operate from Pakistani soil, why has all that not worked? Is the world not putting enough pressure on Pakistan to get rid of this whole dalliance with terrorist proxies, or the use of terrorist proxies as a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, again, see, the international action against terrorism requires, work along several prongs, and it is not always clear that everything moves in the same direction or at the same pace in which a country like India will. Which is why I believe that, in the fight against terrorism, diplomacy is actually at least as important as the military dimensions of it. We have to continually not just catalyze international action against Pakistan, but to make sure that the normative consensus that is built up against terrorism. Because, see, one of the things that we should concede, if you look at the statements given by practically all the countries in this crisis, everyone has outright condemned what has happened as an act of terror. Nobody has said that, we didn't see, for instance, a kind of language which would be used perhaps in the 1990s saying, oh, some people are freedom fighters while for you they are terrorists, etc. I mean, no such one-sided or, that on the one hand, on the other hand kind of language was used. So that normative consensus is an important one for us. We have to sharpen it. Pakistan, as I said, has its own geopolitical allies. It has various kinds of things. The threshold for action in international fora also tend to be higher than what we may unilaterally want to declare, and so on. So,
for instance, the demand for evidence. I think in India, the public opinion is what evidence? Its evidence is all there across Pakistan. I mean, inside Pakistan, you only have to go there and see this. So this a whole demand for evidence by the international community also angers, of course, the Indian public, but in the leadership, in the Indian leadership, also it is seen as a tiresome kind of request that this is already obvious to you. Why should we keep on putting forth more evidence? And whatever evidence you put to Pakistan is simply not enough for Pakistan to act on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, see, I agree that Pakistan has only very limited interest in wanting to delink itself from this infrastructure that it has assiduously created over several decades and deployed against India. So I think we should be careful. But at the same time, international pressure can increase or decrease. It can be more or less in different areas. And however tiresome we may find it, I think we have to do it. As I said, I mean, see, issues like Kashmir, terrorism emanating from Pakistan are problems that cannot be solved. There is no scalpel which will surgically get rid of this problem for us. We can only manage this problem. And in managing this problem, diplomacy is an important tool in our kind of statecraft. And if we do not manage it, then you'll have to endure the consequences of it. So I think first thing we need to do is to educate public opinion in this country that do not seek for easy solutions. There are no easy solutions in international politics, as there are none in life, and that we have to learn to deal with these things and to be able to have a measured sense of what we can accomplish and in what time frame.
The other thing is that you said that it's very difficult to solve this whole thing with Pakistan. But how have we missed doing something in Jammu and Kashmir that could actually help us prevent these incidents? I mean, not in terms of just security or intelligence, but is there something political that we should be doing and that we have not done that would actually lessen these incidents?
Well, I think, if we take the government's own sort of framing of what is the trajectory of Jammu and Kashmir since 2019, then clearly things have been getting better. The economic situation has developed. There is more interest in not just tourism, but in other kinds of investment in Kashmir. That we want to have more of an integration of the Kashmiris economically with India. And in this, after the Pahalgam terrorist attacks, we saw an somewhat unprecedented upsurge of popular, protests against the terrorist attack, which for anyone who has been following Jammu and Kashmir is, you would concede is a new sort of phenomenon to be confronted with. We have not seen something like that in a while. And I think that definitely offers us a window of opportunity to bring the Kashmiris more to our side. See, at the end of the day, issues like insurgency, terrorism are fundamentally about the hearts and minds of the Kashmiri people. That is what we are fighting for. We want their allegiance. We want them to feel that they have to be with India rather than supporting those who are inimical to our sort of. So it is important, therefore, that I think we still have the window of opportunity to take this forward and do it. The other thing I will say, and I think you were hinting at it in your question on diplomacy. See, I think our position on diplomacy with Pakistan has become more or less that diplomacy is a reward that we will give to Pakistan for good behavior. In my opinion, that fundamentally misunderstands what the nature of diplomacy is. Diplomacy is there to manage very difficult relationships. It is a very important thing for us to have, whether we agree or disagree. Even countries which are at war with each other typically tend to have close diplomatic sort of engagement and contact. So by saying that, listen, we will not talk to Pakistan at all, or that talks and terror cannot go together, I mean, that is true at the level of saying that we do not accept terrorism. But by saying that we will cut off all diplomatic engagement with Pakistan or have only a very minimal kind of diplomatic relationship, is, I think, to deprive ourselves also of certain very important tools, not just of crisis management, but of shaping the relationship in the longer run and managing it. As I said, I am not an optimist who thinks that peace is around the corner and that we're going to have a solution. But I think diplomacy has a somewhat different role than what we seem to be imagining it to be. And treating diplomacy as a reward for any other country's behavior is, I think, to drastically devalue that tool in our hands.
You mentioned the Indus Waters Treaty a little while ago. And India has said now that, of course, that there's going to be no peace dialogue, and Indus Waters, the treaty remains in abeyance. What repercussions might this have in terms of how this whole crisis pans out?
No, I think we have said quite clearly and strongly that the Indus Water Treaty will remain in abeyance.
Yeah.
It will take us a while before we can actually, even if we want to, make systematic efforts to divert flows of water to Pakistan, etc. There are things that we can do in the short run. For instance, we can stop sharing, actual real-time flow of data of river water flows, etc. We can even resort to other things like flushing out our, reservoirs, which will make life somewhat miserable for Pakistani farmers downstream because, you can push out a lot of silt, etc. But beyond those kinds of things, which will only be sort of whatever, which will be pokes and pressures, if we want to systematically kind of deprive Pakistan of any of this, it is going to take us quite a bit of time and thinking to be able to actually come up with all of that. And I do not believe that the Pakistanis will take that kind of a position lying down. Agriculture is a very important part of the Pakistani economy. I think it accounts for about 40% of their GDP. It employs about 40% of their workforce. As a lower riparian, Pakistan has every interest in securing this. So I think, there is an element of hyperbole in the Pakistani response to say that, we'll treat it as an act of war. I mean, it's a bit like India saying we'll treat terrorism as an act of war. I mean, so, but yes, this is an issue. But my broader concern is that, whether it is India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or even China, all countries which have waters flowing out of the Himalayan watershed, I think, with the climate crisis looming and actually on hand and creating new kinds of challenges for us practically with every season, collective action on climate problems and issues is actually going to be a much greater imperative for the subcontinent. In fact, I would go so far as to say that perhaps in the middle term future, it will be even more of a challenge for us than issues like terrorism. So if we sort of walk away from Indus Water Treaty or refuse to abide by whatever provisions there are even for renegotiating, right? I mean, the treaty itself has provisions.
Yeah.
But that will require us to go back to diplomacy rather
Yes.
than walk away from it.
Yeah.
And I think, signaling that we are not interested in any form of collective action will, I think, make things much more difficult for all these countries in the region, including us. Again, see, vis-a-vis China, we are the middle riparian on the Brahmaputra. We have concerns about the Chinese announcements of all kinds of things. For years, we've been saying the Chinese do not share river water flow data. Now, going forward, all of these problems are going to get much more accentuated and aggravated and will assume a magnitude, which will affect common people across this region in significant ways. So I think our willingness to sort of walk the road of collective action on these kinds of questions could be damaging to our own self also. So it's something we need to bear in mind as we think about what are the next steps as far as the Indus Water Treaty are concerned.
When you talk about climate change and water shortages and all the other things that happen, uh, um, uh, are likely to happen, glacial melts, the whole thing. One of the things that the Kashmiris have been saying is that this is going to be a huge problem for that particular region because they are in the Himalayas, and that is where all this is happening, right? And they are saying that this is in this conflict between India and Pakistan, we don't have a voice. Where is our voice in that? Why are we being denied this voice? Isn't that a fair demand?
Oh, it is a fair demand in a sense that any of these kinds of projects will have to take the interests of local populations into account. But again, it's worth remembering that the Kashmiris are actually opposed to the provisions of the Indus Water Treaty for a long time now, because it puts restrictions on how India can use the waters, particularly of the Chenab and Satluj. So there have been sort of calls. In fact, if my memory serves right, there was a resolution adopted by the Kashmir Legislative Assembly in the year 2003, when they said that the Indus Water Treaty must be revisited, etc., because they feel that the state is being deprived of other kinds of energy resources which could come if India were willing to harness these resources more. And there are limitations that the Indus Water Treaty places. And of course, in the new present context, there are other kinds of problems that the Kashmiris are facing and they will face. So I think whichever way you look at it, I think collective action which involves multiple stakeholders is the only way forward for us as we deal with our neighbors or with states within India when it comes to the climate crisis and its implications. So, which is why I feel that we should, whatever the sort of temptation to use the Indus Water Treaty as a point of pressure against Pakistan, we should think about what the medium and long-term consequences could be.
So not just the Indus Water Treaties, but the Kashmiris think of themselves as a stakeholder in this entire conflict. I mean, how can India and Pakistan decide the fate of us Kashmiris? Uh, that this is about us really. And where are we in this whole thing? We are not, even when India and Pakistan discuss even diplomacy, we are not at the table. So that's really the question I asked. If isn't that a demand that has to be addressed at some point?
Well, I mean, I think it is certainly the case that the Kashmiris are, as the state which is embroiled in this particular conflict, central to the way that this particular dispute plays out, etc. And as I said, I mean, we are at this point of time in a situation where Jammu and Kashmir has been reduced to the status of a union territory, etc. The government has already promised that statehood will be restored. I think perhaps moves in that direction are now the first steps that we will need to take in order to create a new matrix within which we deal with Pakistan and do not allow Pakistan or the terrorist organizations to weaponize the Kashmir problem against us, right? I mean, I do see that there is a window of opportunity. It depends on whether we have the political kind of sagacity and wisdom to be able to move in that direction. But the opportunity does seem to be there.
Thank you, Professor Raghavan. That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for your time. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. It was very nice to be here with you.